What drives a man to transform mockery into a weapon more deadly than anything his critics could imagine? What calculations run through a soldier's mind when he realizes that survival depends not on following established doctrine, but on inventing something entirely new? In the mud-choked trenches of World War I, where death arrived in forms both mechanical and medieval, innovation often meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Yet military establishments have always distrusted the creative soldier, the man who questions established methods and proposes solutions that seem too simple, too crude, or too unorthodox to work. The officers who scoffed at a young soldier's improvised grenade trap embodied this institutional resistance to battlefield innovation. They called his contraption stupid, amateurish, a waste of resources that would accomplish nothing. They were still laughing when it detonated. 19 seconds. That was all the time it took for the device to vindicate its creator and silence every critic who had dismissed his ingenuity. 23 German soldiers died in those 19 seconds, caught in a chain reaction of explosions that transformed a supposedly foolish idea into one of the war's most devastating tactical innovations. But this story is about more than a single deadly trap. It is about the eternal tension between institutional authority and individual creativity, about how survival in war often requires breaking rules rather than following them, and about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most effective weapons are not the ones designed by generals and engineers, but the desperate improvisations of soldiers who refuse to die quietly. This is the story of how battlefield necessity became the mother of lethal invention, how mockery transformed into respect, and how one soldier's refusal to accept conventional wisdom changed the way men fought and died in the trenches of the Great War. The Western Front in 1916 existed in a state of perpetual apocalypse. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, two massive armies faced each other across a wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and corpses. Millions of men lived underground in elaborate trench systems, emerging only to kill or be killed in battles that consumed entire divisions for gains measured in yards. The Battle of the Somme alone would claim over 1 million casualties by its end, achieving almost nothing of strategic value. In this environment, a young corporal named Hans Müller found himself assigned to a particularly vulnerable section of the German defensive line near Verdun. The historical record does not preserve his exact birth date or hometown, as was common for lower-ranking soldiers whose stories survived only through the memories of their comrades and the after-action reports that documented their deaths or rare moments of distinction. What is known is that Müller possessed the kind of practical intelligence that formal military training often failed to recognize or cultivate. The stretch of trench Müller helped defend faced a particularly aggressive French unit, known for their nighttime raids. These raids followed a predictable pattern. Under cover of darkness, small groups of French soldiers would crawl through no man's land, cut through the German wire, and attempt to infiltrate the trenches to kill sentries, gather intelligence, or simply terrorize the defenders. The Germans had lost dozens of men to these raids, and morale in the sector was deteriorating as soldiers grew exhausted from constant vigilance. Traditional defensive measures had proven inadequate. Sentries could be silenced before they could raise an alarm. Barbed wire could be cut. Machine gun positions could be identified and avoided. Flares illuminated only small areas and warned attackers that they had been spotted, giving them time to retreat. The French raiders had learned the rhythms of German defensive routines and exploited every weakness with professional efficiency. Müller observed these patterns with the eye of someone who understood that survival required adaptation. He had grown up in a rural area where hunting and trapping provided essential food for his family. He understood the principles of creating mechanisms that would trigger automatically, requiring no human intervention to function effectively. As he watched the raids continue despite every conventional defensive measure, he began to conceive of an idea that would translate his civilian hunting experience into military application. The basic concept was simple, perhaps deceptively so. Müller proposed creating a series of connected grenade traps along the most likely approaches through the German wire. These traps would use tripwires to trigger grenades, but with a crucial innovation. Rather than each wire triggering a single grenade, he envisioned creating a chain reaction. One triggered grenade would set off others through a carefully designed sequence, creating a cascading series of explosions that would devastate an entire raiding party before they could retreat. When Müller first proposed his idea to his immediate superior, a lieutenant who had earned his commission through family connections, rather than battlefield competence. The response was immediate and dismissive. The lieutenant called it a stupid idea, a waste of grenades that would likely kill German soldiers when they accidentally triggered their own traps. He pointed out that grenades were valuable munitions needed for offensive operations, not to be buried in the mud on the off chance they might kill a few French raiders. Other officers who heard about the proposal were equally skeptical. A captain pointed out that the system would be too complex to maintain, that rain and mud would make the tripwires unreliable, that the French would simply spot the traps and avoid them. A major suggested that Müller was trying to avoid frontline duty by wasting time on pointless tinkering. The prevailing view among the officer corps was that proven defensive methods should be maintained, and that soldiers should focus on following orders rather than inventing elaborate contraptions. The mockery extended beyond the officers to some of Müller's fellow soldiers, men who had survived through caution and adherence to established procedures saw Müller's innovation as dangerous experimentation that might draw unwanted attention from higher command or provoke increased French attacks. Others simply found the contraption amusing, a crude device that looked more like something a child might assemble than a serious military weapon. Yet Müller persisted. He had the support of a veteran sergeant who recognized that the current situation was unsustainable, that continuing to lose men to French raids would eventually break the unit's cohesion, regardless of what officers in rear areas thought. This sergeant, whose name has been lost to history but whose judgment would prove sound, authorized Müller to proceed with a small-scale test of his concept using grenades that were already damaged or past their prime reliability. The authorization came with conditions that reflected the sergeant's caution and understanding of military politics. Müller would work during his off-duty hours, ensuring the project did not interfere with regular defensive responsibilities. He would use only materials that were otherwise destined for disposal or that he could scavenge without requisitioning new supplies. And most importantly, he would accept full responsibility if the device failed or caused friendly casualties, shielding the sergeant from blame should the experiment go wrong. Hans Müller's journey to the trenches of Verdun had followed the path of millions of other young German men caught in the machinery of total war. Born in the final years of the 19th century, he had grown up in a Germany that was simultaneously the most advanced industrial power in Europe and a nation still deeply connected to rural traditions and agricultural life. His family had worked the same land for generations, making a modest living through a combination of farming and skilled craftsmanship. From his father and grandfather, Müller learned the practical skills that would later prove invaluable in the trenches. He learned how to work with his hands, how to improvise solutions when proper materials were unavailable, how to understand mechanical principles through observation and experimentation rather than formal education. Most importantly, he learned the art of trapping, a skill that combined patience, understanding of animal behavior, and mechanical ingenuity. Rural Germans of this era often supplemented their income through hunting and trapping. Müller's family was no exception. From a young age, he learned to construct snares and traps that would humanely capture or kill animals without constant human supervision. The principle was always the same: understand your quarry's behavior, identify the paths they would inevitably take, and create mechanisms that would trigger automatically when the quarry followed their natural instincts. These civilian skills created a way of thinking that military training often suppressed rather than encouraged. The German Army of 1914 prized discipline, obedience, and adherence to established doctrine. Individual initiative was valued only within narrow parameters defined by superior officers. The ideal soldier was expected to follow orders precisely, trusting that officers possessed superior knowledge and strategic understanding that lower ranks could not comprehend. When war erupted in August 1914, Müller enlisted along with millions of other young Germans, convinced the conflict would be brief and glorious. The reality he encountered bore no resemblance to those expectations. The war of movement that characterized the initial months gave way to the static horror of trench warfare. Armies that had expected to be home by Christmas instead found themselves locked in a stalemate that would consume a generation. Müller's early combat experiences followed the typical pattern of soldiers learning to survive in conditions no training could prepare them for. He learned to recognize the sound of different artillery shells in flight, to distinguish between the crack of rifle fire and the distinctive chatter of machine guns, to identify the signs that preceded a gas attack. He watched friends die from shells, bullets, disease, and simple accidents in an environment where death was omnipresent and arbitrary. What distinguished Müller from many soldiers was his refusal to accept passivity in the face of constant danger. Many men adapted to trench warfare by developing a fatalistic acceptance that survival was purely a matter of luck. Müller, by contrast, maintained his belief that observation, planning, and ingenuity could improve his odds of survival. He studied the patterns of enemy attacks, noted weaknesses in German defensive arrangements, and constantly thought about how existing resources could be used more effectively. This mindset was not unique to Müller, but it was relatively rare among lower-ranking soldiers who had been trained to defer to authority rather than question it. The tension between individual initiative and military hierarchy had existed as long as organized warfare itself, but the industrial nature of World War I made it particularly acute. The war demanded creativity and adaptation at all levels, yet military structures remained largely unchanged from earlier eras, when officers were presumed to possess superior judgment on all matters. The specific circumstances that led to Müller's grenade trap innovation emerged from months of frustration, watching French raiders infiltrate German positions with seeming impunity. Each successful raid not only cost lives but eroded the confidence and morale of the defenders. Soldiers began to dread nighttime duty, knowing they might be killed silently by infiltrators before they could react. The psychological impact of these raids exceeded their actual tactical significance. Müller's observation of the French raiding patterns revealed several key insights. First, the raiders always approached through specific gaps in the wire where German defenses were weakest. Second, they moved in small groups that stayed close together for mutual support. Third, they relied on speed and surprise rather than sustained combat. And fourth, they used the same routes repeatedly, having identified the safest approaches through careful reconnaissance. These observations suggested that a properly designed trap could be devastatingly effective. Unlike active defenses that required soldiers to detect and respond to threats, a trap would function automatically, turning the raiders' own tactics against them. The challenge was creating a mechanism that would be reliable, deadly enough to neutralize multiple attackers, and capable of functioning in the harsh conditions of the Western Front. Müller's hunting experience provided the conceptual framework. He understood that effective traps required several elements: proper placement along routes the quarry would inevitably use, triggering mechanisms that were sensitive enough to activate reliably, but not so sensitive they would trigger accidentally, and killing mechanisms that were quick and certain. He also understood the importance of concealment, ensuring the trap would not be detected until it was too late. The specific design Müller developed reflected both his practical experience and his understanding of available materials. He proposed using standard German stick grenades, which had several advantages for this application. Unlike the egg-shaped grenades used by other armies, German stick grenades had a handle that could be used to stake them in place. They also had sufficient explosive power to kill or wound multiple men within their blast radius. The innovation lay in how Müller proposed to connect multiple grenades into a cascading system. He envisioned setting grenades at intervals along likely approach routes, with each grenade's pin connected by wire to the next grenade in the sequence. When a raider tripped the initial wire, it would pull the pin from the first grenade. That explosion would trigger the pulling of the next pin through either the blast itself or through additional wire connections, creating a chain reaction that would proceed down the entire line of grenades. The theoretical elegance of this system was apparent to Müller, but it was not obvious to officers trained in conventional military engineering. They saw a crude contraption that seemed as likely to fail as succeed, and they worried about the risks of maintaining such a system in an active combat zone. Their skepticism reflected a broader institutional bias against innovations that originated from common soldiers rather than from officers or professional military engineers. The French raiding unit that Müller's trap would eventually target had built a formidable reputation over months of successful operations. Led by a lieutenant whose tactical skill had earned him both decorations and the respect of his men, this unit specialized in what the French called coups de main, sudden violent strikes designed to kill, capture, and terrorize. They had conducted over 40 successful raids with minimal casualties, developing techniques and teamwork that made them among the most effective raiding forces on the Western Front. These raiders were not reckless volunteers seeking glory, but professional soldiers executing carefully planned operations. Each raid began with days of reconnaissance, observing German positions through periscopes and listening posts, identifying vulnerabilities and planning approach routes. They studied the timing of German sentry rotations, the locations of machine gun positions, the patterns of flare usage. By the time they launched a raid, they possessed detailed intelligence that minimized risks and maximized chances of success. The raiders' training emphasized stealth, speed, and close-quarters combat. They learned to move silently through no man's land, to communicate through hand signals, to kill quickly and quietly with knives, clubs, and grenades. They practiced wire-cutting techniques until they could slice through German barriers in seconds. They rehearsed their raids on replica trenches constructed in rear areas, refining their movements until every man knew his role precisely. This level of professionalism made the French raiding unit particularly dangerous, but also created vulnerabilities that Müller's trap would exploit. Their success had bred confidence that bordered on complacency. They had used certain approach routes so many times without incident that these routes had become habitual, familiar paths that no longer received the careful scrutiny that earlier raids had demanded. The very experience that made them effective also made them predictable. The resistance Müller faced when proposing his grenade trap illuminates fundamental tensions that have existed throughout military history, between innovation and institutional inertia, between tactical creativity and strategic doctrine, between the knowledge gained from frontline experience and the authority claimed by hierarchical command structures. Military organizations face a perpetual dilemma regarding innovation. On one hand, warfare demands constant adaptation as adversaries develop new weapons, tactics, and strategies. Armies that fail to innovate become obsolete and suffer defeat. On the other hand, military effectiveness requires discipline, standardization, and adherence to established procedures. An army where every soldier improvised their own methods would descend into chaos. This tension becomes most acute during extended conflicts like World War I, where the same armies fight over extended periods, allowing patterns to develop and vulnerabilities to be identified. The soldiers directly engaged in combat often possess the clearest understanding of what works and what fails in actual fighting conditions, yet these soldiers typically occupy the lowest ranks in military hierarchies, designed to concentrate decision-making authority in the hands of officers. The officers who mocked Müller's grenade trap were not necessarily incompetent or malicious. They represented a military culture that had developed over centuries, one that prized certain virtues that had proven their value in previous conflicts. Discipline, obedience, and adherence to established doctrine had won countless battles. Officers who had spent years studying military history and theory naturally distrusted improvisations from soldiers who lacked formal training. Moreover, officers faced pressures that made them inherently conservative in their approach to tactical innovations. They were responsible not just for winning battles, but for maintaining unit cohesion, conserving resources, and avoiding disasters that could end their careers. An innovation that failed might be attributed to the officer who authorized it, while successful conventional operations were simply expected. The incentive structure did not encourage tactical experimentation. The specific objections raised against Müller's trap also reflected legitimate concerns. Booby traps and similar devices were inherently dangerous to the soldiers who deployed them. Friendly casualties from such devices were not uncommon. The concern that German soldiers might accidentally trigger their own traps was not irrational, particularly given the chaos and confusion that characterized frontline conditions. Similarly, the worry about maintenance was grounded in real experience. The Western Front's environment was extraordinarily harsh on equipment. Mud, water, rust, and the constant vibration from artillery could disable mechanisms that worked perfectly under controlled conditions. Many elaborate defensive systems had been deployed only to fail when actually tested in combat. Officers had learned through bitter experience to be skeptical of complex mechanisms that depended on everything working correctly. The question of resource allocation also merited consideration. Grenades were valuable munitions with multiple uses. Devoting them to static defensive traps meant they would not be available for offensive operations or for responding to enemy attacks. In an environment of constant resource scarcity, where supplies often failed to reach frontline units, officers were understandably reluctant to commit valuable weapons to experimental systems of uncertain effectiveness. Yet beneath these practical objections lay deeper assumptions about knowledge, authority, and the proper relationship between ranks in military organizations. The officers who dismissed Müller's proposal were implicitly asserting that significant tactical innovations should originate from officers trained in military science, not from common soldiers who lacked formal education. This reflected class assumptions that were deeply embedded in European military culture. The German army, like most European militaries of this era, drew its officer corps primarily from the upper classes and maintained sharp distinctions between officers and enlisted men. Officers were expected to plan and command. Soldiers were expected to obey and execute. A soldier who proposed tactical innovations was transgressing these established boundaries, claiming expertise that his social position did not entitle him to possess. This class dimension helps explain why the mockery directed at Müller's trap was often personal and demeaning, rather than professionally critical. Calling it a stupid contraption reflected not just technical skepticism, but social contempt, an assertion that a common soldier who thought he could teach officers about warfare was presumptuous and ridiculous. The mockery served to reinforce social hierarchies as much as to evaluate technical merit. The concept of the grenade trap also challenged prevailing assumptions about the nature of warfare and the proper conduct of soldiers. European military culture maintained a distinction, however tenuous, between legitimate combat and murder. Soldiers were expected to face their enemies directly, to demonstrate courage under fire. Booby traps, mines, and similar devices that killed enemies automatically seemed somehow dishonorable, closer to assassination than to combat. This attitude reflected older notions of military honor that coexisted uneasily with the industrial slaughter of World War I. Even as armies deployed poison gas, flamethrowers, and other weapons that would have been considered barbarous in earlier eras, there remained an attachment to ideas about proper military conduct. Müller's trap, which would kill enemies who triggered it without giving them any chance to fight back, violated these lingering notions of honorable combat. The French raiders themselves represented an interesting contradiction in this regard. Night raids that involved creeping through darkness to silently kill sentries were themselves departures from conventional notions of honorable combat. Yet they had become accepted as necessary tactical adaptations to trench warfare. Müller's trap simply took this logic one step further, automating the ambush that the French were conducting manually. The broader context of World War I illuminates why innovations like Müller's trap emerged from frontline soldiers rather than from senior commanders. The war had quickly exceeded the conceptual frameworks that military leaders brought to it. Pre-war doctrine emphasized mobility, maneuver, and decisive battle. The reality of trench warfare bore no resemblance to these expectations. Generals who had spent their careers studying the campaigns of Napoleon found themselves commanding static battles more reminiscent of medieval sieges. This disconnect between doctrine and reality created space for improvisation at lower levels. Soldiers facing immediate life or death situations could not wait for senior officers to develop new doctrines. They improvised solutions using whatever materials were available, creating a kind of bottom-up innovation that military hierarchies were poorly designed to recognize or incorporate. Müller's trap represented one example of this phenomenon, but countless other innovations emerged from similar circumstances. The grenade trap also reflected a shift in the nature of combat that World War I represented. War was becoming increasingly mechanized and automated. Artillery fired from miles away, killing soldiers who never saw their attackers. Machine guns allowed a handful of defenders to slaughter entire companies of attackers. Poison gas killed indiscriminately. In this context, a trap that killed automatically was not an aberration but rather an extension of trends that were transforming warfare itself. The psychology of mockery itself deserves examination. When officers and fellow soldiers ridiculed Müller's trap, they were not simply expressing technical skepticism. Mockery serves social functions that extend beyond the ostensible subject being mocked. It establishes and reinforces social hierarchies, punishing those who step outside accepted roles. It provides psychological comfort by dismissing ideas that challenge established ways of thinking. It creates group solidarity by identifying outsiders whose ideas can be collectively rejected. For officers whose authority rested partly on claims to superior military knowledge, Müller's innovation represented a threat. If a common soldier without formal training could develop effective tactical innovations, what justified the officer class's monopoly on military decision-making The mockery served to neutralize this threat by framing Müller as a delusional amateur rather than as someone whose practical intelligence might rival or exceed that of his superiors. For fellow soldiers, the mockery served different functions. Some genuinely believed Müller's trap was dangerous or foolish and ridiculed it out of honest conviction. Others participated in the mockery to align themselves with authority, demonstrating loyalty to officers by echoing their dismissive attitude. Still others mocked the trap because acknowledging its potential would require admitting that survival might depend on individual initiative rather than collective adherence to established procedures, a psychologically uncomfortable recognition. The dynamics of innovation in life or death situations create unique pressures that civilian contexts rarely replicate. In business or academic settings, failed innovations typically carry limited personal consequences. In combat, failed innovations can kill not just the innovator, but everyone around them. This reality creates legitimate conservatism, a well-founded reluctance to experiment when the costs of failure are measured in lives. Yet this same reality also creates desperate motivation to find solutions when existing methods are clearly failing, as they were in Müller's sector. The actual implementation of Müller's grenade trap required solving numerous practical challenges that his critics had correctly identified. The theoretical elegance of a cascading chain of explosions had to be translated into a mechanism that would function reliably in the mud and chaos of the Western Front. Müller's solution demonstrated the practical intelligence that formal military training often failed to cultivate, but that frontline survival demanded. The first challenge involved placement. Müller spent several nights observing the approaches to the German positions, identifying the specific routes that French raiders used most frequently. These were not random paths, but reflected rational choices about where German wire was thinnest, where machine gun fields of fire had gaps, and where the terrain provided the most cover. By understanding the raiders' perspective, Müller could predict with reasonable certainty where they would attempt to infiltrate. He selected a section of the line where the ground sloped gently toward the German trenches, providing raiders with a natural approach route that took advantage of dead ground invisible from German positions. Previous raids had come through this area repeatedly, and intelligence suggested the French considered it one of their more reliable infiltration routes. If the trap was going to work, this was where it would have the best chance of catching raiders in numbers, sufficient to justify the effort. The actual construction required careful attention to detail. Müller used 10 grenades, spacing them at intervals that would maximize the overlap of their blast radii, while ensuring each grenade would be triggered by the previous explosion. He staked each grenade into the ground using sharpened wooden stakes, positioning them at angles that would direct the blast horizontally rather than vertically, maximizing effectiveness against human targets while minimizing the chances of the blast simply throwing the next grenade in the sequence out of position. The triggering mechanism represented the most delicate aspect of the design. Müller used fine wire for the trip lines, positioning them just above ground level, where raiders crawling forward would inevitably contact them. Unlike simple tripwire systems, where the wire directly pulled the pin from a grenade, Müller's design used the tripwire to trigger a release mechanism he had constructed from metal, scavenged from damaged equipment. This mechanism then pulled the pin from the first grenade, beginning the sequence. The chain reaction itself relied on both blast effects and secondary wire connections. Each grenade in the sequence had its pin connected by wire to a release point that would be triggered either by the blast from the previous grenade or by the pulling action of the wire itself if the blast failed to sever it. This redundancy was crucial, as Müller understood that no mechanism was perfectly reliable under combat conditions. By creating multiple ways for each stage to trigger the next, he increased the probability that the chain reaction would proceed to completion. Concealment posed another significant challenge. The system had to be invisible to French raiders during their reconnaissance of the approach routes, yet had to remain functional despite being exposed to weather and the occasional artillery shell that landed nearby. Müller used natural materials to camouflage the grenades and wires, arranging mud, grass, and debris in patterns that would seem natural rather than deliberately constructed. He paid particular attention to the tripwires, ensuring they blended with the random detritus that littered no man's land. The maintenance requirements proved less onerous than critics had predicted. Müller established a routine of checking the system every night after dark, testing the wire tensions, verifying that the grenades remained properly positioned, and replacing any components that showed signs of deterioration. This maintenance took perhaps 30 minutes each night, a modest investment given the potential payoff. The sergeant who had authorized the experiment insisted that Müller brief the other soldiers in the sector on the trap's location and operating principles. This was essential to prevent friendly casualties and to ensure that if Müller was killed or wounded, someone else could maintain the system. These briefings also served another purpose. They forced the other soldiers to acknowledge that Müller's contraption was real and potentially functional, not just a joke to be dismissed. As Müller completed the installation and began his nightly maintenance routine, he faced continued skepticism from many quarters. The officers who had mocked the initial proposal remained convinced it would fail. Some predicted the first rainfall would disable the system. Others suggested the French would spot it during their reconnaissance and simply avoid the area. A few darkly joked that the trap would kill Müller himself during one of his maintenance checks. Yet Müller persisted with the confidence of someone who understood both the principles behind his creation and the behavior of his intended targets. He had designed the system based on sound mechanical principles and careful observation of enemy patterns. Unlike many military innovations that were developed in rear areas by engineers with limited frontline experience, his trap had been conceived and constructed by someone who lived daily with the problem it was meant to solve. The waiting period that followed installation tested Müller's confidence and his unit's patience. Several nights passed with no French activity. Some soldiers began to suggest that the French had indeed spotted the trap and were avoiding the area. The officers who had opposed the project seemed vindicated, noting that scarce grenades were sitting uselessly in the mud while French raids continued against other sectors of the line. Then, on a moonless night, with low clouds that created nearly perfect conditions for infiltration, a French raiding party began their approach through the sector Müller had trapped. Intelligence reports reconstructed later indicated that this party consisted of 25 experienced raiders, veterans of dozens of successful infiltrations. They had planned to penetrate the German lines, kill sentries, and gather intelligence on German dispositions in preparation for a larger attack planned for the following week. The raiders moved with the confidence born of experience and success. They had used this approach route before and knew its advantages. They crawled forward in darkness, cutting through the outer German wire with practiced efficiency. They maintained tactical spacing that allowed them to support each other while minimizing their vulnerability to area weapons. They were doing everything correctly according to their training and experience. The lead raider was a corporal who had participated in nearly every raid this unit had conducted. He moved with practiced efficiency, testing the ground ahead for obstacles, guiding the men behind him along the safest route. He had survived dozens of these infiltrations and expected to survive this one. When his hand contacted what felt like a strand of wire stretched across his path, he had only a fraction of a second to register what it meant before the first grenade detonated. The lead raider's hand contacted the tripwire at approximately 2:30 a.m. What happened next would be described in after-action reports, witness statements, and the horrified accounts of German soldiers who heard but could not see the catastrophe unfolding in no man's land. The first grenade detonated with the distinctive crack of German explosives. In the confined space where the raiders were concentrated, the blast was devastating. Shrapnel tore through the lead men in the formation, killing 2 instantly and wounding 3 others. But this was merely the beginning. 2 seconds later, the second grenade detonated. The raiders, trained to respond to explosions by seeking cover, were still processing what was happening when this second blast caught them attempting to scatter. More men fell, and the wounded from the first explosion were killed by this second one. The third grenade detonated 4 seconds after the first. By now the raiders understood they were in a trap, but the darkness and chaos made effective response impossible. Men were screaming in pain and terror. Some tried to crawl forward toward the German lines. Others attempted to retreat back toward French positions. The fourth grenade killed several of these fleeing men. The cascade continued with terrible precision. 5th grenade, 6th grenade, 7th grenade. Each explosion came so quickly after the previous one that the individual detonations blurred into a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to chase the raiders as they desperately tried to escape the kill zone. German soldiers listening from their trenches described it as the sound of hell itself, a mechanical fury that transformed night into a sustained moment of industrial death. By the time the 10th and final grenade detonated, 19 seconds had passed since the first explosion. In that 19 seconds, 23 French raiders died. The 2 survivors were so badly wounded that they were unable to reach their own lines and were captured by German soldiers who ventured into no man's land after the explosions ceased. The immediate aftermath was characterized by stunned silence. German soldiers who had mocked Müller's trap now struggled to process what they had just heard. The officers who had called it stupid found themselves confronting evidence that the crude contraption had been more effective than any defensive measure they had implemented. In 19 seconds, Müller's trap had inflicted more casualties on French raiders than had been achieved through months of conventional defensive operations. One of the captured French raiders, interviewed before dying from his wounds, provided chilling testimony about the trap's psychological impact. He described how the first explosion had shocked, but not panicked his unit, as single grenade detonations were common in trench warfare. But as the explosions continued in rapid succession, each seeming to anticipate where the raiders were attempting to flee, terror had replaced training. Men abandoned tactical discipline and simply ran, making themselves easier targets for subsequent explosions. The trap had not just killed through physical force, but through the psychological effect of sustained, inescapable threat. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Word of the trap spread through both German and French lines with remarkable speed. German morale, which had been declining due to the constant French raids, suddenly reversed. Soldiers who had dreaded nighttime duty now felt they had been given an effective tool to strike back at their tormentors. The sense of helplessness that had characterized their defensive posture evaporated. For the French, the impact was equally profound, but opposite in effect. The raiding party that had been annihilated was composed of some of their most experienced and successful raiders. These men had conducted dozens of successful operations and had developed a justified confidence in their abilities. Their sudden destruction by an automated trap created fear and uncertainty that rippled through French units tasked with conducting similar operations. French commanders faced a difficult dilemma. They could not allow a single German innovation to paralyze their raiding operations, yet they could not ignore the very real danger the trap represented. They began requiring more extensive reconnaissance before raids, looking for signs of similar traps. This reconnaissance took time and made raids more predictable. Some French units simply refused to conduct raids through areas where traps might be present, severely limiting their operational flexibility. The German High Command's response to Müller's success revealed the complexity of military innovation and institutional recognition. On one hand, they could not ignore the tactical effectiveness the trap had demonstrated. On the other hand, acknowledging that a common corporal had developed a significant tactical innovation without authorization or formal training threatened established hierarchies and procedures. The immediate response was to classify the incident and restrict information about the trap's specific design and operating principles. This reflected security concerns, as widespread knowledge of the system might allow enemies to develop countermeasures. But it also served to limit Müller's personal recognition, ensuring that he would not become too celebrated as an example of successful innovation from below. Müller was promoted to sergeant and received a modest decoration, but not the more prestigious medals that officers typically received for tactical innovations. The official reports credited the success to German defensive preparations generally rather than to Müller's specific innovation. When higher headquarters did eventually authorize wider deployment of grenade traps, the credit was given to the engineering corps, who standardized and distributed the design, not to the soldier who had invented it. This pattern of appropriating innovations from lower ranks while limiting recognition to the original innovators was common throughout World War I. Countless tactical adaptations and technical improvements originated from frontline soldiers, only to be institutionalized and credited to the formal military hierarchy once their effectiveness was proven. This reflected not just individual ambition, but systemic biases about where legitimate military expertise was presumed to reside. The officers who had initially mocked Müller's trap responded to its success in various ways. Some acknowledged they had been wrong and gave Müller grudging respect. Others rationalized their initial skepticism by noting that many improvisations failed and that their caution had been prudent, even if wrong, in this specific case. A few simply avoided mentioning the incident, as though collective amnesia could erase their embarrassing misjudgment. The lieutenant who had first called Müller's idea stupid found himself in a particularly awkward position. His dismissive judgment had been proven spectacularly wrong, undermining his authority in the eyes of his men. He responded by attempting to claim partial credit, suggesting that he had only expressed skepticism to test Müller's confidence and commitment to the idea. This transparent rationalization fooled no one but allowed the lieutenant to save face while avoiding direct acknowledgement of error. The broader military community's reception of grenade traps as a defensive measure illuminated tensions between innovation and doctrine that extended beyond individual personalities. Once Müller had demonstrated the concept's effectiveness, military engineers began developing standardized versions that could be mass-produced and deployed systematically. These official versions were often more sophisticated than Müller's improvisation, but they rested entirely on principles he had pioneered. Yet this institutionalization also transformed the innovation in ways that diminished some of its original advantages. Standardized designs were less adaptable to specific local conditions than Müller's custom installation had been. Official procedures for deployment and maintenance were more rigid than the flexible approach Müller had developed through trial and error. In being absorbed into official doctrine, the grenade trap lost some of the improvisational creativity that had made it effective in the first place. The question of how many lives Müller's innovation ultimately saved is impossible to answer with precision, but the impact was undoubtedly significant. The immediate effect was to reduce French raiding activity in sectors where grenade traps were known to be deployed. Raiders who had previously operated with confidence now approached German lines with fear and hesitation, reducing their effectiveness even when they were not caught in actual traps. Over the longer term, the proliferation of grenade traps and similar automated defensive measures contributed to the already formidable lethality of defensive positions in World War I. They represented another increment in the advantage defenders enjoyed over attackers, another reason why offensive operations consistently failed to achieve breakthroughs despite horrific casualties. In this sense, Müller's innovation contributed to the stalemate that characterized the war, making it even more difficult for either side to achieve decisive victory. The moral questions raised by automated killing devices like Müller's trap have never been fully resolved. Critics argued then, and argue now, that booby traps represent a form of combat that removes human judgment from killing, reducing war to a mechanical process devoid of ethical consideration. Soldiers triggered the trap through accident rather than deliberate hostile action, and the automated nature of the killing seemed to some to cross ethical boundaries that should be maintained even in war. Defenders of such devices countered that war itself had become mechanized and industrial, that artillery and machine guns already killed automatically without requiring individual judgment for each death. The grenade trap, in this view, was simply one more adaptation to the reality of industrial warfare. Moreover, the raiders who died in the trap were themselves engaged in lethal operations, intending to kill German soldiers. The trap merely defended against this threat more effectively than human sentries could. The question of proportionality also arose. Was it morally acceptable to design a weapon specifically intended to kill entire groups of enemy soldiers simultaneously? Traditional combat ethics, such as they existed, had generally assumed that soldiers killed enemies individually or in small numbers through direct action. Mass killing was associated with artillery and machine guns, weapons whose impersonal nature had already generated ethical controversy. Müller's trap added another dimension to this debate by creating a weapon that was both automated and designed specifically for mass casualties. Some military ethicists argued that the trap was actually more humane than alternatives. The raiders died quickly, most likely without prolonged suffering. This compared favorably to the alternative of detection followed by machine gun fire, which often left soldiers wounded and dying slowly in no man's land. From this perspective, the trap's efficiency represented a perverse form of mercy, killing quickly rather than inflicting prolonged agony. The question of whether Müller deserved more recognition than he received reflects broader issues about how military achievement is acknowledged and rewarded. Throughout military history, common soldiers have developed countless tactical innovations that saved lives and won battles, yet formal recognition typically flowed to officers who commanded units or authorized operations rather than to the individuals who conceived of novel approaches. This pattern reflected practical realities as well as social biases. Military operations involve too many individuals for everyone who contributes to receive formal recognition. Awards and decorations must be rationed to maintain their value. Officers who command units bear responsibility for their actions in ways that justify special recognition. Yet these practical considerations cannot entirely explain the systematic pattern by which innovations from below were appropriated and credited to the institutional hierarchy. The case of Müller's trap also illuminates how innovations can have effects far beyond their creator's intentions. Müller designed his trap to solve a specific tactical problem in a specific location. He sought to protect himself and his immediate comrades from French raids that threatened them directly. He did not envision his innovation being adopted throughout the German army or influencing tactical doctrine for decades to come. Yet this is precisely what happened, demonstrating how small-scale innovations can have large-scale consequences. The French army's response to the proliferation of grenade traps involved both tactical and technological adaptation. Tactically, they developed new reconnaissance techniques, specifically designed to detect traps before raids began. They trained raiders to recognize signs of disturbed ground, unusual wire patterns, or other indicators that traps might be present. They varied their approach routes more frequently, avoiding the kind of predictable patterns that had allowed Müller to position his trap effectively. Technologically, French engineers developed their own booby trap systems, creating a kind of arms race in automated defensive weapons. They also developed tools for clearing German traps, including long poles that could trigger tripwires from a safe distance and protective equipment that might allow soldiers to survive explosions that would otherwise prove fatal. This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation would continue throughout the war, with each side developing increasingly sophisticated automated weapons and countermeasures. The evolution of grenade trap technology throughout the remainder of World War I demonstrated how rapidly military innovation could proceed when battlefield necessity demanded it. Within months of Müller's initial success, both German and Allied forces had developed multiple variants of automated explosive traps. Some used electrical detonators instead of mechanical triggers, allowing for remote activation. Others incorporated time delays that made the traps more difficult to clear. Still others used dummy traps mixed with real ones, forcing enemy engineers to treat every suspicious object as potentially lethal. Hans Müller survived World War I, though records of his later life are fragmentary. He returned to Germany in 1918, witnessed the chaos of defeat and revolution, and apparently lived quietly for several decades afterward. Unlike more celebrated military figures whose exploits were chronicled in detail, Müller disappeared back into the civilian population from which the war had temporarily extracted him. His grenade trap became a footnote in military history, known to specialists but absent from popular narratives of the war. The trap's legacy, however, extended far beyond its immediate tactical impact. The principles Müller had pioneered, the use of automated mechanisms to create cascading defensive effects, influenced military thinking for decades. During World War II, similar concepts appeared in more sophisticated forms. The German S-mine, or bouncing Betty, used triggers to create devastating anti-personnel effects. American forces developed elaborate booby trap systems in the Pacific Theater. The fundamental insight that triggered mechanisms could multiply defensive effectiveness became standard military doctrine. Yet with this proliferation came consequences that Müller could not have anticipated when he first proposed his crude contraption in 1916. Landmines and booby traps became among the most persistently deadly legacies of modern warfare. Long after conflicts ended, these devices continued to kill and maim civilians. Children playing in fields decades after wars ended would trigger mechanisms that transformed play into tragedy. The automation of killing that Müller had pioneered for defensive purposes evolved into weapons that could not distinguish between soldiers and innocents. This raises uncomfortable questions about innovation and unintended consequences. Müller conceived his trap to solve a specific tactical problem in a specific context. He sought to protect himself and his comrades from raids that were killing them with seeming impunity. His invention worked precisely as intended, achieving the immediate objective of stopping French infiltration. Yet the principles he pioneered contributed to developments that caused suffering far beyond the trenches of Verdun. Can an innovator be held responsible for how others adapt and extend their innovations? Müller designed a defensive mechanism for use in active combat zones against armed enemies. The landmines that would later kill civilians incorporated similar principles but served different purposes in different contexts. The ethical relationship between the original innovation and its later applications remains contested and complex. The mockery Müller endured before his trap's success reflected institutional attitudes that persist in modified forms today. Military organizations continue to struggle with balancing the need for innovation against the requirements of discipline and standardization. They continue to grapple with questions about where legitimate expertise resides and how to encourage creativity without sacrificing coherence. The tension between hierarchical authority and individual initiative remains unresolved because it reflects genuinely competing values that cannot be fully reconciled. Modern militaries attempt to institutionalize innovation through formal processes, creating positions and procedures designed to encourage creative thinking while maintaining control. Innovation cells, lessons learned databases, and rapid fielding initiatives represent attempts to capture the kind of bottom-up creativity Müller demonstrated while channeling it through official structures. Yet these attempts often struggle to replicate the desperate improvisation that characterized innovation in World War I trenches, where survival provided motivation that institutional processes cannot replicate. The story of Müller's grenade trap reminds us that some of history's most significant innovations emerge not from planned research and development, but from individuals solving immediate problems using whatever resources are available. The trap was not the product of engineering expertise or theoretical knowledge, but of practical intelligence applied to a specific challenge. Its success demonstrated that valuable expertise exists at all levels of organizations, that formal authority and actual competence are not identical, and that institutions that fail to recognize this distinction do so at their peril. The 19 seconds during which Müller's trap killed 23 men represented a moment when theory became reality, when mockery transformed into respect, when assumptions about knowledge and authority confronted undeniable evidence of their inadequacy. Those 19 seconds vindicated not just a specific mechanical device, but a way of thinking that valued observation, creativity, and practical problem-solving over deference to established procedures. Yet vindication came at a cost measured in lives ended and bodies shattered. The French raiders who died in those 19 seconds were someone's sons, brothers, perhaps fathers. They were professionals doing their duty as they understood it, employing skills learned through training and experience. Their deaths, however tactically justified from a German perspective, represented human tragedy multiplied by 23. The efficiency of their killing does not erase this fundamental reality. This duality characterizes all military innovation. Every advancement in killing efficiency represents both tactical success and human tragedy. Every device that protects one's own forces does so by more effectively destroying enemy forces, composed of human beings who possess their own stories, relationships, and reasons for fighting. The grenade trap was simultaneously a triumph of ingenuity and an instrument of industrial slaughter, both protective mechanism and killing machine. The officers who mocked Müller's trap were wrong in their specific judgment, but their skepticism reflected wisdom accumulated through centuries of military experience. Most improvisations fail. Most innovations prove ineffective or create problems worse than those they solve. The conservative instinct to favor proven methods over untested novelties has saved countless lives and prevented countless disasters throughout military history. That this particular innovation succeeded does not invalidate the general principle of institutional caution. Yet institutions that are only conservative eventually become obsolete, overwhelmed by adversaries who adapt more quickly to changing circumstances. The challenge is not to choose between innovation and tradition, but to find ways of balancing these competing imperatives. Military organizations must be conservative enough to maintain effectiveness and discipline, yet innovative enough to adapt to new challenges and opportunities. Finding this balance requires humility about the limits of existing knowledge and openness to insights that may emerge from unexpected sources. The transformation of mockery into respect that followed the trap's success was less complete than it might appear. While Müller gained recognition within his unit, the broader military establishment never fully acknowledged the implications of his innovation. Had they done so, they might have created systematic processes for identifying and evaluating soldier-initiated innovations, for recognizing that valuable tactical insights could emerge from any rank, for building institutional cultures that encouraged rather than discouraged creative problem-solving at all levels. Instead, Müller's trap remained an exceptional case, an interesting anomaly rather than a lesson about how military organizations should function. The hierarchy that had mocked his innovation absorbed its benefits without fundamentally questioning the assumptions that had led to the initial mockery. Officers continued to presume that significant tactical innovations should originate from trained professionals rather than common soldiers. The class and educational distinctions that separated ranks remained intact. This pattern repeated throughout World War I and in subsequent conflicts. Time and again, frontline soldiers developed tactical innovations that proved effective, only to have these innovations appropriated by the institutional hierarchy, with minimal recognition to the original innovators. The system learned specific lessons about tactics and technology, while failing to learn broader lessons about how innovation happens and where expertise actually resides. The legacy of Müller's 19 seconds thus extends beyond questions of military tactics to broader issues of how organizations learn, adapt, and acknowledge expertise. His story illuminates the perennial tension between individual creativity and institutional authority, between bottom-up innovation and top-down control, between established procedures and necessary adaptation. These tensions exist in all human organizations, not just military ones, and resolution remains as elusive today as it was in 1916. Perhaps the final lesson is one of humility. The officers who mocked Müller's trap were not fools or villains, but professionals working within a system that shaped their perceptions and judgments. Müller was not a neglected genius, but a practical man solving an immediate problem using available resources. The trap's success reflected not eternal truths about warfare, but specific circumstances that made a particular innovation effective in a particular context. And the 19 seconds that killed 23 men represented neither pure triumph nor pure tragedy, but the complex reality of warfare itself, where survival requires innovation and innovation requires killing. Today, the section of the Western Front where Müller deployed his trap has been reclaimed by nature. The trenches have eroded, the wire has rusted away, and the landscape shows little evidence of the slaughter that occurred there. Tourists visit the region to see monuments and cemeteries, to try to comprehend the scale of suffering that transformed this landscape into a graveyard for a generation. They do not visit the specific spot where Müller's trap killed 23 men in 19 seconds, because nothing marks that location or commemorates that event. This obscurity reflects a broader pattern in how military history is remembered. The great battles, the famous generals, the strategic decisions that shaped campaigns receive attention and commemoration. The small tactical innovations, the moments of individual ingenuity, the specific incidents that determined who lived and who died, largely disappear from memory. Yet these forgotten moments, multiplied countless times across the vast canvas of warfare, often matter more to the soldiers who experienced them than the grand narratives that historians construct. Müller's grenade trap killed 23 men in 19 seconds and changed how defensive warfare was conceived and executed. It vindicated an individual against institutional mockery and demonstrated that expertise can emerge from unexpected sources. It reflected both the horror of industrial slaughter and the survival-driven creativity that war demands. And it reminds us, across more than a century, that the most consequential innovations sometimes emerge not from those who command authority, but from those who confront necessity with nothing more than practical intelligence and desperate determination to survive. The ghosts of those 23 French raiders remain in that field in France, forever caught in 19 seconds of mechanical fury that ended their lives before they could process what was happening. They died because they were predictable, because one German soldier had studied their patterns with a hunter's patience, because innovation found opportunity in their routine. Their deaths validated Müller's trap, but also illustrated the pitiless efficiency of industrial warfare, where machines and mechanisms kill with a thoroughness that human combatants alone could never achieve. And somewhere in those same fields rests whatever physical trace remains of Hans Müller himself, the corporal whose refusal to accept conventional wisdom transformed mockery into lethal reality. He deserves to be remembered not as a genius or a hero, but as an example of how necessity can drive creativity, how observation can generate insight, and how the most effective solutions sometimes come from those whom authority dismisses as unqualified to propose them. His 19 seconds changed warfare. The question remains whether we have learned the broader lessons his story offers about innovation, authority, and the nature of expertise itself. In the end, Müller's story stands as testament to a fundamental truth about human conflict and human ingenuity. When survival hangs in the balance, when established methods fail repeatedly, when authority dismisses practical wisdom, individuals will sometimes find ways to overcome institutional inertia through sheer determination and creative intelligence. The trap that killed 23 men in 19 seconds was crude, improvised, and built from scavenged materials by a soldier with no formal engineering training. Yet it worked. And in working, it proved that the most important military innovations sometimes come not from those with the most authority or the best credentials, but from those with the most immediate need to survive and the courage to act on their observations despite mockery and dismissal from those who claim superior knowledge.